in places such as Colombia, Mexico, and India. It's really great to be here with quite a distinguished panel. We've got a great group of people from the social sector, people with experience in the public sector as well as the private sector impact investment community. And so we're looking forward to hearing from them, but also hearing from you guys. Social impact bonds. Actually, in the past 4 months, really, after years of talk about social impact bonds in the US, really in the past 4 months, we've seen a number of really important deals come through in the US. Deals in Utah and in early childhood development, which we're going to get to a little bit later on, as well as in New York City, and Massachusetts. That in addition to the 16 social impact bonds that are currently in implementation in the UK. So really, what are social impact bonds? What are their relevance for Latin America? Are they relevant for Latin America? And what are going to be some of the main barriers to social impact bonds in Latin America when we think about adapting this model to Latin America? These are really the core questions that we want to get at, that we want to understand, and that we want to cut through the hype and kind of address in a very clear, concise way with this panel. First, I think it's worth kind of starting with a couple basics for those who might not have heard of social impact bonds. What are social impact bonds? So social impact bonds are a multi-stakeholder partnership to scale up cost-effective social programs. Multi-stakeholder because they involve both the public and the private sector. Private sector investors financing cost-effective social programs with the government ultimately paying back based on results. Social impact bonds are a new type of public-private partnership for the social sector. So how do social impact bonds work? And I think to understand how social impact bonds work, it's useful to start from what's the status quo of social sector financing in a lot of low and middle income countries, right? And oftentimes when programs are financed by governments or by donors, by international donors, it involves a contract, a relationship between somebody who's willing to pay for the program and a service provider who's willing to deliver that program. That contract might specify, say, this social service provider, this nonprofit, or this organization is going to work in 100 villages and treat 10,000 people. The money might be delivered up front or maybe in the best of cases at certain milestones, but it's really a contract based on a certain set of activities. What a social impact bond does is it tries to flip the switch. Flip the switch from focusing on activities to actually focusing on the results that those activities produce. So it's centered around what we see here as this pay-for-success contract, right? A pay-for-success contract which specifies, I government or I international donor, I'm going to pay you not based on how many girls you work with, but how many girls you enroll in school. How many learning level improvements you can actually get those girls learning in school. Diabetes program, I'm not going to pay you based on how many diabetic people you work with. I'm going to pay you based on exactly how many of those diabetic people after a year or after 3 years are actually in a controlled state, have controlled their diabetes, right? So it's focused around this pay-for-success contract. And then on back of that pay-for-success contract, how is this service provider going to scale up their programs? That's where the investment capital comes in. And this is investment capital that is able to invest in a social program that normally wouldn't be market ready, who doesn't have any source of income. Based on this pay-for-success contract, the investor can invest provide working capital to the service provider in order to scale up their social programs. And then based on an independent evaluation that measures the social returns, the social outcomes based on the service provider's program, the outcome payer, the government or the donor, will pay based on success, returning the investment capital, returning basically this investment capital back to the investor. Let's walk through some of the basic investment premises. So what type of investment is this? It's basically where does the investment money go? The investment money goes towards working capital to scale up this social program. This might be a program to enroll girls in school, a public health program to manage diabetes, other types of programs. What is the type of this investment? It's a bit of a misnomer that it's being called social impact bond because it's not exactly a bond. And I think that's important, particularly for an investor audience to understand. It actually has a lot of quasi-debt, and depending on how it's structured, sometimes quasi-equity elements to it, okay? So there's the potential for principal loss if the program doesn't actually deliver the results. But also there's an upside, as we can see here, that varies with the measured impact of the project. So it actually has some quasi-element type features to it. And this upside, all of this repayment, comes from this government entity or this international donor, which is paying based on success. What this does, what does this investment premise do? This investment premise basically aligns the private sector and the social sector towards better programs delivering results. The investors, the service provider, everybody's focused on achieving a greater social impact, which then is aligned with a greater financial return. So what are some of the benefits of social impact bonds? Very quickly, obviously it's a more direct way to do good and do well. A social impact bond enables investors to invest in programs that they normally would never be able to invest in. Number two, it incentivizes better programs. Now, instead of focusing on what types of activities this service provider is delivering, if they get out into the field and they realize that their original workshop or their original way of approaching the problem was different than the way that actually is going to work, they can immediately adapt and iterate because we're being tight on outcomes and loose on process, right? And then third and finally, and very much related, greater social innovation. This kind of focus on results enables a greater adaptability and iteration to the specific needs of the community. Of course, social impact bonds are a very new instrument, and it's very important to recognize that they come with a lot of drawbacks. First is that obviously they're difficult to put together. Bringing the public sector together with private sector investors is sometimes not an easy proposition. And particularly in Latin America, where a lot of people aren't potentially familiar with this instrument, it's going to require a lot of market education. Number two is that this investment in social programs presents a whole new set of risks for investors. And we're going to get into this a little bit later. And then third and finally, we must be honest, there's little to no track record in Latin America. While we do have a lot of experiences in places like the UK, in the US, and in other high-income countries, there is yet to be a social impact bond in Latin America. Where have social impacts come and gone? This is social impact bonds about a year ago. About last year, Hannes Lohmann, our CFO, was presenting here, and this was what the map looked like about a year ago. We saw a lot of movement from the UK, where they had about 3 or 4 social impact bonds online. What we're seeing now is that in this past year, there's really been an explosion, both in interest in designing social impact bonds, but actually in putting the pedal to the metal and actually implementing social impact bonds. So I mentioned those 4 social impact bonds that are now in implementation that have been announced in the US around early childhood development in Utah, around criminal recidivism in New York State and New York City, and also around workforce development. These are some of the big movements that have happened in the market over the past year. And we're seeing a lot of interest as well from low and middle income countries. And these are some of the areas where we've seen that interest. So what potential does it hold for Latin America? We're going to explore these topics very shortly with our panel, but very, very quickly I wanted to deep dive into exactly what one of these deals look like, to really understand and pick apart what is it that a social impact bond is doing. So this is a social impact bond that was around early childhood development that was recently announced in Utah. What it's doing is that Goldman Sachs and J.B. Pritzker are the investors. They're investing up to $7 million to provide high-quality preschool education for boys and girls aged 4 and 5 in Utah, working with up to 3,700 children aged 3 to 4, with the idea that by investing at an early age in high-quality preschool education, we can actually drive significant value into the primary school and secondary school. And specifically, based on some rigorous evidence and some rigorous impact evaluations that were previously done, the investment proposition is that by investing in high-quality preschool education, we're going to actually avert future entrance into special education programs. And these special education programs are extremely costly. About 33% of low-income students in this area normally participate in special education, and this special education costs about $2,600 a year. Okay, so we're talking about a significant expenditure each year by the government that we can actually prevent by investing in high-quality preschool education. Based on an independent impact evaluation by an independent entity, a research institute in Utah State University, the Granite School District and a set of other outcome payers will then pay out based on exactly how many of these students that were initially treated, how many of these initial 3,700 children were actually prevented from going into special education, okay? And there's an investment structure here that has a debt component as well as a more equity-like component. This is one example of a social impact bond. What we're finding is that actually the way that these social impact bonds are structured actually varies quite a significant amount based on where it is. So there's no one specific way to structure this. With that, I want to jump into really the experts here, which is our panel. We've got Virgilio Barco, who we'll begin with. Virgilio Barco is currently the Regional Investment Director for Acumen. Virgilio previously worked helped found and was the Executive Director of the Banca de Inversión Social in Colombia, which really spearheaded the impact investment space in Colombia. And previous to working with the Banca de Inversión Social, held positions in the public sector in government, in the Investment Promotion Agency of Bogota, as well as in the Colombian Ministry of Finance. So Virgilio, from your perspective, you've had a very interesting career coming from both the public sector and now entering into the impact investment space. What are the major barriers to developing social impact bonds from the perspective of the public sector, engaging in these types of pay-for-success contracts, and then actually developing these social impact bonds?
Yeah, so well, thank you. It's really great to be here. I mean, I've had over the past, couple of years discussions with government officials, leaders of nonprofits, impact investors, and there's, I think, all over Latin America, there's a huge interest in social in SIBs, and enlightened politicians, people like Sergio Fajardo in Antioquia, really see this as a way to achieve outcomes rather than a series of outputs. And I think, private sector investors and nonprofits see this as a really great way to start bringing some private sector discipline to social outcomes. So I think there's a lot of interest. Nonetheless, I think what experience has shown us in the first years, and this is all very, very early stage in Latin America, is that there's certain challenges to bringing in the government in the short term. And these have to do with, there are a number of issues. One is cultural sort of challenges. The fact of paying a private investor for a premium for a social outcome that in itself is challenging. These are projects that have a very long lead time. So when you have the election cycle, when you have rotation of government officials, and that that it's really it's difficult because a lot of work in setting up the structures can then not lead to anywhere. There's an inherent difficulty in bringing innovations, these type of innovations, to bureaucracies, and government officials are just used to paying for outputs, so many talleres, so many procedures and so on, and this is just a change in their mindset. There's challenges also in how and who will pay for the structuring, because these are complex structures and they require an intermediary and lawyers and so on, and the expenses can be quite high. And furthermore, and this isn't true everywhere, but these are structures that are multi-year, and often what you find in Latin America is you have 1 year budgeting cycle, so that sort of adds complexity. What's interesting though is that I think that there's what we've seen, and I've been accompanying Instiglio, the organization that Michael founded, is that there's private sector and nonprofit players who are stepping in and I think may play a very interesting role in the short term in Latin America. So these are organizations that they're naturally willing to take on this type of risk, and they want to see what you can learn from these structures. They don't have the term limits, and then excuse me, and then finally they're happy to cover the structuring costs. So I think my sense is that in the short term, the way it's going to play out in Latin America is that you'll see you'll see sort of the more traditional type of projects that my colleague described, but we also see projects that are entirely nonprofit and private. So you'll have nonprofits paying for the outcome, and you'll have investors or not who will be receiving the premium. So that's sort of my sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now to Eliza. Eliza is currently the Director of Investments for Imidiar, with a focus where she focuses on Latin America. Formerly, Eliza worked at the Calvert Foundation, making investments into the financial inclusion space. Imidiar is, of course, a very interesting organization in this space in social impact bonds, because they've played a very significant role in both the UK and in the US in supporting the social impact bond intermediaries there, and more broadly in market infrastructure. So Eliza, what do you see, particularly from Imidiar's perspective, as some of the main lessons from those investments, or basically that market building infrastructure in the US and the UK, and how much of that is applicable to Latin America?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me and for this interesting panel. Just a brief bit of history on us and our involvement with social impact bonds. It's very brief because social impact bonds are very new. So ON was established by Pierre Omidyar in 2004 as a philanthropic investment vehicle. And Pierre was the founder of eBay and innovated kind of even in his philanthropy. So we operate both a early stage equity investment vehicle for high growth businesses serving low to moderate income people in a variety of areas, including financial inclusion, and a foundation also to concentrate on market infrastructure in these sectors. So it gives us a flexibility to both invest and build market infrastructure, which is very relevant in the SIB space because it needs both market infrastructure as well as investment capital. So coming to the topic of SIBs, we took a risk and provided early seed funding to both Social Finance UK and Social Finance US, who are the sort of principal intermediaries and sort of innovators and visionaries in this space, in addition to Instiglio, in pioneering the first transactions in the US and the UK and sort of really the whole philosophy around SIBs. And as I was telling my fellow panelists at lunch, we sort of, the investment lead who brought this forth was, brave, because this fit into none of our boxes, none of our investment priorities. People were like, what is this? But she was very convincing and got it through. And one of the reasons she got it through is we thought, there's some really exciting principles being tested here in social sector finance. One is the focus clearly on results, and in particular, reorienting the government and the public sector towards results. And as Virgilio said, not just inputs or outputs. The acknowledgement, secondly, that the public sector really has no risk capital. There's no way the public sector can test and evaluate new ideas. It tends to fund the same old things over and over again, incumbent interventions, without a real thought as to outcomes. It's because what they've already always done. But to sort of defend them a bit, they really don't have risk capital. They're not going to be spending tax revenue on the latest new shiny thing. So it's an acknowledgement of that really SIBs come to play, and clearly a structure that could eventually capture, emphasis on eventually, capture commercial capital for scale. And so those were three principles we thought were really interesting to test. So now I'll finally get to your question, and run through some of, again, our very early observations. This is very early. From an investor perspective, because that's one we always take, there's clearly limited performance data available. There are early results from the first UK transaction that are coming in quite promising. So that's a good sign. Conceptually, for investors, there's potentially low correlation to public equities here. So when you think about what investors, really commercial investors, look like when they're constructing a portfolio, often lack of correlation is promising because these are not dependent on a traditional exit. There's potentially, almost as the Kleisners were saying in their earlier comments, some insulation against systemic downturns. So that's interesting. And some wholesale vehicles are being raised to ensure supply of capital. So Bridges Ventures in the UK raised one. Goldman Sachs is now raising one in the US. So this is promising so that each transaction doesn't have to sort of beat its head against the wall in raising money. There will actually be pools of funds dedicated towards these transactions. So that's promising as well. So going to the challenges from an investor perspective, and some of them were raised here. This instrument, it is not a bond, to be clear. You are potentially taking equity-like risk, and you have essentially a fixed income return. So there's a capped return when you have a chance of loss of principal. So there's a bit of a misalignment from a pure, investment perspective in terms of risk and return. That might be solved through fancy structuring and innovation, but still, as it stands now, that's a bit of a misalignment. Another challenge I think folks will face is this sort of prospect of underwriting social service providers. How do you evaluate a social service provider as an investor? That's not your core competency to look at, nonprofit education providers or reproductive health and family planning NGOs. That's not something you're particularly good at. So how do we do that? So just a few more observations. One Virgilio touched on is the sort of perception and political risk issue. So there's perception problems on both sides. From the government side, they sort of say, let me get this straight. I'm repaying private investors with a premium for these social services. This is a little bit odd. And on the second side, there's a perception problem from private investors as well, as they say, wait a second, we're fronting the government to pay for basic services. That's not, what about the social contract? This is not something we should be paying for. So there's perception issues on both sides. And the other issues, which I think are real, is this is not just an impact investment capital gain. There's real philanthropy required here. These are specialized transactions that take very smart people and very technical skills to put together before they are investable. Therefore, there's a depth of philanthropy that we can't ignore. This is not just about raising investment capital. So those are some of the kind of early, we think very promising, very interesting opportunities. Some challenges remain. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And now we have Zach Levy. Zach Levy is currently an associate at the Multilateral Investment Fund at the Inter-American Development Bank. Zach, from your perspective, looking across Latin America, what is it that really interests the Inter-American Development Bank about social impact bonds? And how do you see this market developing over, say, the next 3 to 5 years?
Sure. So for an institution like the Multilateral Investment Fund and the American Development Bank, whose core business is reducing poverty in Latin America, it's a very interesting proposition and very interesting model in that for us it brings 3 very kind of important themes that have been kind of very much integrated within how we look at development in our institution into a single thing, which is the focus on impact evaluation and evidence. So really for us, trying to have a much more rigor in how we look at the things we finance and having much more of a greater ability to actually have some comparative ability on how we finance it. The idea of impact investment, which has been a growing part of our portfolio. We have a unit called the Opportunities from the Majority Initiative, which focuses on basically pyramid finance as well as do a lot of equity-like investing for impact investing. And then public-private partnerships. How do you bring both the capital and know-how of the private sector in partnership with government to support development? Development does not necessarily have to be a public sector thing, but the private sector can be a partner on equal footing with government to support common objectives. So with that, it's a very interesting model for an institution like the Inter-American Development Bank. And it brings some key, very interesting things. It brings rigor and market discipline to the social sector, which has oftentimes lacked it. It brings, with the private capital know-how and that tension with the private sector, it brings new forms of innovation that may not be able to occur outside of government. And it brings scale. So whether it's impact investing, whether it's social entrepreneurship, or whether it's the myriad kind of grant projects that we finance ourselves to support social problems, oftentimes these innovations and these solutions that we develop can't reach real scale to reach and to tackle the magnitude of poverty that exists in the region. So many times, whether it's a social enterprise or an NGO that has a solution that really works, it's very difficult to bring that solution to a much, much larger scale, to bring in 25 million, 30 million to actually, bring it. So this could be a mechanism to really take solutions that work to a much larger scale. Now, without a doubt, there's the short-term and the longer-term view of this. And this is a model that's been trialed in its early stage in other countries, and in Latin America will face many more challenges. And we're only starting to kind of hit the tip of the iceberg. So just to maybe run through a few. So on the regulatory side, for governments, whether it's Latin America and also the United States, social sector funding's done annually. So each year the legislature has to approve the budget for a social program. This is a multi-year commitment of funding. It requires kind of continuity and multi-year kind of commitments, which may not be permitted under the existing regulatory framework. So there needs to be a way of creating that solution. So how can governments actually pay for success to that contract? In addition to that, there's the broader risks related to the appropriations. Even if they can do it, how do you ensure that money's there across the political administrations, so that many of us who are investors and who have worked in have seen examples of expropriation in infrastructure, want to be sure that if there's actual success, that whatever political administration is there is able to do it. So there needs to be some creative thinking around how to get around those regulatory challenges. And Latin America is not monolithic. So the regulatory barriers in Colombia aren't going to be necessarily the same as in Brazil. Brazil is very different, and as well as in Mexico. In some cases, it may be more straightforward or simple. In other cases, it may not. And never underestimate the power of political will. The second is deal flow. So what we need, we don't have investable assets now, and so we're a panel of 3 potential investing institutions, but we don't have social impact bonds in Latin America that are at a stage where they can be really talking to investors about investment. The ones we've seen in the UK and in the United States are tailored around problems of those societies. And so what does that mean for Latin America is a big question. So we need a strong pipeline that's both transferable across countries and easily replicable. So as Eliza said, it's very, very expensive to design these things, and it requires philanthropy, both in terms of the studies, putting all the pieces in place, the contracts, the lawyers. Those need to be standardized to an extent to where it actually can exist without philanthropy, and we're not there yet. So on our end, we're looking at how an institution like the Inter-American Development Bank could support both the capacity needs and financing needs of government, as well as how to catalyze the broader players within the private sector, both in terms of researchers, potential intermediaries that develop these, as well as the service providers, which are typically NGOs, to do it. And we're hoping to launch an initial pilot program in the coming months to at least begin to look at this in Latin America.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Zach. Now what we want to do is we want to open it up to you guys. You've heard a little bit about some of the thoughts and perspectives from the panelists, but we really want to hear what some of your thoughts are. So please feel free to great. To make up a line. I'll kick it off with a first question to the panelists, which is, based on all of your experience in Latin America, where you guys see as the major opportunity areas in terms of sectors where do you see as the major opportunity areas in Latin America where you think actually a social impact bond would be really viable? And then what are maybe some places where it might not be viable?
So one of the, I think the promising areas is the one that is in the Utah example, which is early childhood development. Early childhood development is, I think, as hopefully most of us know, has been demonstrated to have significant impact on a range of important outcomes: labor market productivity, school achievement, and is perhaps one of the highest returns on investment in education that the public sector can have. It far exceeds primary and secondary schooling. Yet there is very little supply in most emerging markets, including Latin America. And Latin America has taken a real leadership role in political commitment to ECD. So there are mandates in Brazil and Mexico for universal programming for ages 3 to 5 at a minimum, but there's very little supply of those programs. So given the strong link to evidence and the need for supply, I think that's a very compelling area. And in terms of repaying the investments, that sources of savings are many. Special education is one. You can also look at reduction in juvenile justice, a variety of ways that the government saves from ECD interventions. So it would both serve, the increase in supply and really rigorous evaluation. In a region that's already made a political commitment, it's harder to make the case in other countries that have not yet made the political commitment to ECD. So that's one idea.
Yeah, no, I think if you look at poverty and the provision of public services in Latin America, basically coverage is getting there. So you look at the large cities, things like education, health are, most countries, at least in the urban areas, are achieving 100% coverage. And what I think is that the social impact bonds are like a brilliant way to tackle the next challenge, which is how do you improve quality. So I think they're particularly relevant for countries that are in this stage of development. And I think education and health are two areas that, there's a multitude of applications.
Great. Let's open it up to you guys. What sorts of questions do you have about social impact bonds?
Rahul Desai, also from the Inter-American Development Bank. Here you might clarify, but I'm just thinking of in the investors in the existing bonds in the developed countries mostly. It sounds like a lot of the stuff in the U.S. is community development money or foundation money. How much are traditional investors really? Because what Eliza says is totally true. It's a kind of weird instrument in that you have bond upside, which is none, and you have equity downside, that is all. So I'm wondering how much in the developed countries the mainstream investment market is in it. And the thing I'm having trouble thinking is who in Latin America would be the investors, because more than, I think there are 1 million on the side of social services organizations in sectors which are susceptible to this, and even governments who might be coming around in certain places, but more a question on what kind of investors, or do we expect cross-border investors to be the ones who start this thing off in Latin America?
In terms of what kind of investors I'll let you start with the...
Okay, well, I'll kick it off. From our perspective, we've seen a variety of different types of investors get interested about this. Of course, a lot of it right now, we need to be honest, is cheap talk because there hasn't yet been a social impact bond deal that has gone through in Latin America. But we do need to be clear. For the lack of track record, we're looking, again, if you were to put the investors out on a continuum from kind of financial first to socially oriented investors, in Latin America, at least the ones that are most interested in this are, of course, the ones that have a major focus on mission. To your question about investors in the U.S. and high-income countries, maybe how that has evolved, maybe Eliza, you'd like to touch on that, yeah.
Yeah, no, you're up. I mean, I think the first answer is absolutely right. There's a spectrum, and we're going to probably start with the more philanthropically minded. It is interesting that Goldman Sachs has come into a number of transactions already. And you can sort of ask why. A lot of it came out of their urban investment group that does a lot of community development finance, as you point out. But, and one of the transactions in New York was highly enhanced by a guarantee. So, you know, it sort of dealt with that issue around the equity downside. And that may be the kind of structuring that has to be done early on to bring in commercial players or, you know, players of a variety of ilk that are not yet going to come in early with the philanthropic players. But I think that has an important signaling effect. So it's worth enhancing those transactions if you can get, you know, a larger range. And I would argue enhancing them earlier, so that you do, so this doesn't, you know, because if it becomes, you know, the first 4 transactions are exclusively philanthropically invested, you know, it sends a message to the market that there's a window for us to, you know, sort of command interest on this issue. And so I would argue that we enhance them earlier. And some people say, oh, well, that was an enhanced transaction, but it sends a message to the market. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my thinking is constantly evolving on this, and if you would have told me 6 months ago that Goldman Sachs, you know, would have financed 3 of these deals, when I found out, it kind of blew my mind. And I think there's several other major U.S. investment banks kind of looking into this, which is interesting, and also, you know, how it's curious how this market will evolve. In Latin America, I think, you know, these first ones will have, you know, definitely investors who are socially motivated, and I think it has to be. And I think, you know, as we develop these first ones, we need to really think through structures that can really make sense for a market. And I personally think that the idea of full principal loss has to be tossed out the door. It's just not a you know, an attractive investment proposition. That, you know, perhaps it's partial loss, but I think governments need to be able to get comfortable with, you know, having some floor, either half, 75% of principal loss. So there's some risk sharing, but not to the extent that there is. And I think, you know, there are many foundations, grant-making institutions that are financing this anyways. So how, you know, is it possible to bring these 2 types of capital together, and, you know, can they be comfortable with perhaps, you know, crowding in another type of capital into a single asset, which is nobody likes to do, but it may be a different way of thinking about expanding the pool of money for the social sector. But I think it's going to be a process, but I think the kind of onus is on all of us who are trying to test this to establish good quality precedents for the market, which will kind of set the stage. And I think kind of, you know, the temptation to do it easy may be there, but I think it may impact the ability to do this in the future.
Yes. My question is regarding the metrics, and especially in Latin America, how are you tackling or looking at the issue of metrics, and in particular for investors to feel comfortable with the metrics of success? What's going to be a success factor? What's not? And especially because, well, I feel in Latin America there's lack of track record on measuring outcomes. So how you set a benchmark or initial baseline?
All right, I'll take this one. So at Instiglio, we really look for really the top 1% of service providers. Rahul mentioned there's probably, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of service providers in Latin America. We're really looking for the cream of the crop, at least, especially to begin with. We want to take these cream of the crop service providers and be able to scale them to achieve much greater impact than they're currently achieving. So we're looking for organizations that are already measuring their impact on a daily basis, that are collecting data, that are doing impact evaluations potentially, right? And that we can go in, do kind of a historical performance analysis based on the data that they already have, and put together a credible case to an investor that this is actually, that what they achieved before is actually going to be replicable with a relative low risk in the future, right? And so we need to be very clear. This is not for every social service provider. This is not for every topic area. This is for a very specific set of topic areas that are measurable, that have defined outcomes, that have a high return on investment. and for a very specific set of service provider that is already measuring what they're achieving and that is really ready to take their model and really push it to scale.
Would anyone like to add upon that, or should we go to the next?
Why don't we go to the
Next
next
question.
one? Yeah.
Hi, I'm curious to hear from you guys in kind of like testing this idea with governments in Latin America. What has been their kind of like behavior and what has been Vigilio touched on some really good points that are just common everywhere in the world in terms of, you have terms and there, there's the political view, but I think in Latin America some of these are exacerbated or could be gamed a bit more. I'm just curious to know if they saw it as like, great, I can now even make more money, or great, just curious from your experience so far.
Yeah, I think, it kind of goes back to, Latin America is a very, very, diverse region, and, there's a common language, actually not necessarily a common language, but maybe a common hemisphere. But there's a lot of differentiation. I mean, even, doing venture capital in Colombia is very different from doing venture capital in Brazil, and very different from doing it in Mexico. So the reactions we've had have been, diverse. In one country, the government was very interested in it, and has been talking to us on it, but it has a very left-leaning administration. So the challenge is they can't, they can't be perceived as paying a return to the private sector. The idea of paying by results, increasing transparency, accountability, all these things hit home and expanding, social services. But, there needs to be a way of creatively thinking how they can get over that public perception and risk of paying a return to the private sector for something which, goes back to the whole social contract, which, people believe government is responsible for doing. In other countries, it's another country, at a state government level, there was a whole lot of interest in moving it forward, but there's kind of the motivations were around the innovation of it. It's something different, and the the regulatory barriers at the state level were very easy to remedy. But that's when you have a champion and also a common legislature and government administration. And then I think in the case of Colombia, there was a whole variety of different lessons learned around high interest at the top, but then when you got down to the deeper bureaucracy, it's it starts to threaten how people do their work, because you're essentially saying we have this nice model and we can do what you've been doing better, and in the process we're actually going to expose you as an organization, and it would apply for us too, that we may have been financing things that haven't been working, which as a public official is anathema. It's a huge risk that you've spent all this money and in reality it hasn't had the impact that you've said in it. So it's challenges that really depend on a case-by-case scenario, and I think it's each government needs to be treated within the specific needs and dynamics of that government.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Thanks. This is more a provocation than a question. We're at a proof of concept stage, like impact investing was 10 or more years ago. So regarding if investors are ready for it, no, there are no real impact bonds where you can put your money into. But who drove impact investing? It was some high-risk people who said, let's create these investment vehicles and let's get it going and see where it goes. My second comment was on, since we are at a proof of concept stage, is it possible to create a private social impact bond? State is not involved, bunch of high-powered foundations, philanthropic organizations, blah, blah, get together, assume the role of the government. They've been investing in early childhood education. Okay, let's set aside a piece of our money, create that private social impact bond, prove the concept, and then the government comes in. Like we did for impact investing, where now the states, or some of them, are actually participating in these funds.
You've actually brought up a topic that's of debate probably amongst some of us. I think there's differing opinions. I'll pass maybe a microphone to Michael first.
Well, it's interesting. We're certainly seeing a lot of interest from international donors. Now, an international donor like USAID, there's a government behind them. But international donors like USAID and like DFID, which is the UK version of the USAID, have been investing, have already been doing kind of what's called results-based financing, which is paying for outcomes at a very small level usually. So it might be kind of 10% of the contract based on outcomes. And so a lot of these organizations have already taken a significant step forward towards what might become a social impact bond, or what they're actually calling development impact bonds. And there's been some great work done by the Center for Global Development and Social Finance, who got together and brought together a working group with the World Bank, USAID, DFID, and a number of other high-profile actors to really think through these ideas about how that might work. Other type of private players who might be involved are also foundations. We've been seeing, I mean, as you mentioned, some interest from some foundations which might not be ready for social impact bonds, but do actually want to change the way that they're financing philanthropy by focusing on outcomes and results. So I think there's opportunity there, but it's good. It remains to be seen kind of what that exactly will look like here in Latin America.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think the foreign aid agencies are an interesting place to start because they're not, totally private, but they're very incentivized with slashed budgets to prioritize their funding based on outcomes. And so they're starting, like DFID, for example, to create an outcomes fund. That's one of the wholesale vehicles I was talking about, so that every bond doesn't have to recreate the wheel in raising capital. And so I think they're a promising piece of the puzzle. The question then becomes, though, is how does that have the desirable demonstration effect? What's the theory of change from a fully privately funded vehicle to a public-private partnership? Will governments see the light and, see the evidence and be compelled by sort of non-political objectives? So it's sort of, I think for those of us who are in the seat of potentially being pitched these transactions, is there has to be a theory of change that we can believe in that leads to, I think, the future we all desire. So that's, I think, the debate, some of the debate, at least the debate on our side, around a fully private financed vehicle, or ones that where local government does not have skin in the game. And so sort of walk me through that path a little bit.
No, I think, Danielle, you're right. I mean, I'm convinced that these purely private structures make sense. I mean, right now there are foundations that are paying for outputs, and they have no idea what they're getting in return. So why not, pay for an outcome and have it measured more, more strictly, and then, maybe somebody else will pay for it. So I think I think those structures are totally viable. I think the theory of change, and I think, what we can gain from this is at least getting investors comfortable with these structures. So it's, and it'll be also a way to start educating government officials, but so.
Well, hold on, maybe I mean, I'm a bit of a hardliner on this one a little bit. I mean, in my opinion, what these shouldn't be is a fancy and expensive way of diverting resources from one way to doing it another way. For me, it's about scale. So it's about social innovations that occur, and you need to bring them to scale. So doing it through, grouping private philanthropy, that's great, but it's just a very expensive way of doing it. But with very scarce resources. So you're never going to get the scale. The only way you get scale is the public sector that can mobilize large amounts of resources around a social problem. And Latin America is not Africa. We have governments that have resources, that have sophisticated bureaucracies, that have fairly sophisticated financial markets, and an increasingly sophisticated third sector. So my personal belief is that I think we can hold them to a higher standard, and it may be a little bit challenging at first, but if we're going to invest all these resources into the structuring of these transactions, which, as Eliza alluded to earlier, then let's try to do it in a way that can bring us to a scale that we need. And I think I would prefer to have that philanthropic money not paying for outcomes necessarily, but actually acting as investment capital within the actual transaction, or financing all the market building work that's really needed to move this forward, which is a critical factor. Now, one area may be a hybrid, so perhaps a private philanthropy alongside government could partially pay for the outcomes, or could provide some half-half, which may also provide some additional security to investors that there's somebody's going to repay something. It sounds bad, but the risk of the government not repaying is always it's always an issue. But it's I think we can hold Latin America, at least several countries, to a higher standard.
In the back, yes.
Yes, hi. In fact, it's very much what you just said. I work in an NGO that works on improving quality in Latin American education in Latin America in public schools. We do teacher training. And basically, the idea of us doing our programs is we believe that the end results of our programs, if we do well, is them becoming public policy. We will never replace the government. There's no way an NGO will and that shouldn't be the end result for us. So it is about public policy, and it is about getting the skin in the game from the government and getting the government to a higher standard, like you just said. I completely agree with that. I think the challenge for some of us is that we find ourselves in a situation where we are ready to scale, but scaling is very difficult. Fundraising is very difficult. Getting the government's interest and funding is very difficult. So to me, it's really necessary to have a public-private partnership. That's the beauty of the social impact bonds. I think that's key. But there's also other issues that have to do with when a small organization is trying to get the government to be involved in programs in education, and not just early childhood, but just throughout elementary and secondary school, getting the government involved in programs that have proven and are evaluated and have proven to be successful and have impact and metrics that you can show. How do you get their interest? And that's not, even if you have the results there and the metrics, it's not necessarily easy for them to show interest and buy on that. And the other thing that we face a lot is that the accountability of defaulting on a small NGO such as us is very, very small, very low. I mean, any default that the government will have on us has no consequence to the government. But if we had a third party in the equation where they would take part of the risk and the government would be facing higher consequences on defaulting, is at least a higher leverage point that we would have on our own. I mean, in a way, we're a little bit like, trying to fight this huge giant and trying to get, equal terms. And it's clear that that's never going to be the case. If we get defaulted on in a commitment, there's no consequence for the government, and there's not much that we can do. Now, third parties can come in and have a different view and a different, much stronger leverage on that. So that's just more a comment, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, and maybe there's experiences in the UK or elsewhere where that has proven to be the case. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think as we talked last night, and Halika and I had a conversation about this, and this real issue of defaulting on NGOs, like actual contracts between the government and NGOs, and there's very little accountability. So this was sort of an additional layer I hadn't thought of around sort of elevating the accountability of government in contracts with sort of proven outcomes, proven accountability, public-private is yet another sort of potential benefit. And I'm trying to think if I don't think I have anything else to say. I'm just in full support, I think, of an added layer. It's sort of a political economy piece, and there are a lot of political economic factors here.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time.
We've been
Short comment.
By the way, Michael, Angelica's organization is one of your top 1%. So if you're looking for someone to do the first social impact bond, they're the people.
Fantastic. So I'll hand it back to Michael, maybe for the last closing statement.
Well, first of all, thank you all to the panelists. I think we had a really fantastic conversation where we touched on a lot of really interesting topics and some really interesting innovations in the model that we're seeing, and how actually social impact bonds in Latin America might not look exactly like the social impact bonds we're seeing in the US and the UK. And maybe that's okay, at least to start out with. So I want to thank the panelists. I also want to thank all of you. We've had a fantastic turnout, and we've obviously seen a lot of interest. So we look forward to kind of continuing to see where this market develops. And thank you again for coming.